Adewale, the young billionaire, stood at the window of his study, looking out over the sprawling garden that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. His fingers drummed restlessly on the edge of the desk, but his eyes were far away, lost in thoughts no one else could see. He was alone in the room, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. How had it come to this? His empire was vast, stretching from the heart of Lagos to the edges of the continent. Yet, it had never brought him peace. Wealth had failed to fill the emptiness inside him. The world saw him as a symbol of success, a beacon of what one could achieve with enough drive and ambition. But all Adewale felt was a quiet ache, a gnawing loneliness he could no longer ignore. The door creaked open, and in stepped Mama Nkechi, the elderly maid who had served his family for as long as he could remember. She had a way of entering a room without making a sound, yet always commanding attention. Tonight, her presence felt different, more urgent, more watchful. "You're not sleeping, Master Adewale?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Adewale didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned away from the window, his gaze fixed on the letter on his desk. It was sealed, an action that felt almost final. His heart raced in a way that felt wrong. "Have you thought this through?" Mama Nkechi continued, her tone soft but firm. "You're about to change everything, everything you've built." He sighed deeply and finally looked at her. There was something in her eyes, something that made his pulse quicken. "I don't know if I can keep going on like this, Mama Nkechi. I've been thinking about it for weeks. Months, even. What's the point of having all this wealth if it doesn't lead me to something real? Something genuine?" Mama Nkechi's face softened, and she stepped closer, the weight of years in her every movement. "But Amara. She's just a girl. She doesn't belong in your world." His heart skipped a beat at the mention of her name. Amara. The maid's daughter. The one who had entered his life like a quiet storm, disarming him with her laughter, her warmth. A girl from a world so far removed from his own, and yet, the only one who had ever made him feel truly seen. "I don't know what you're talking about," Adewale replied, his voice sharper than he intended. "She's just a friend." Mama Nkechi studied him with a mixture of worry and something else, something that could only be described as resignation. "You cannot build a life with her, Adewale. People will talk. People will tear her apart, tear you apart. The world isn't kind to those who dare cross lines that shouldn't be crossed." Adewale stood silently for a long moment, his mind racing. He knew what Mama Nkechi was saying was true. The world would never understand. But then again, who was he living for? The world? Or himself? Without another word, he reached for the letter on his desk, the decision that had been eating at him for days now made. He glanced at Mama Nkechi, his eyes hardening with resolve. "This will change everything," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But it's the only way." Mama Nkechi didn't ask what he meant. She had lived long enough to know that some things were better left unsaid. And then, the unexpected happened. The door slammed open with a force that echoed down the hallway, and a figure rushed into the room. It was Amara, breathless, her eyes wide with panic. She had never looked more beautiful than she did in that moment, with her hair falling in wild curls around her face, her dress clinging to her like she had just run through the rain. "Adewale," she gasped, her voice thick with urgency. "You have to listen to me. I heard them talking. There's something wrong. Something dangerous. They're planning to take everything away from you." Adewale's heart froze. His mind, already reeling from his internal conflict, now whirled with the implications of her words. "What do you mean?" he demanded, his voice tight. Amara stumbled forward, her hands shaking. "I don't know all the details, but I overheard them. They've been conspiring against you. They want to ruin your business. They want to destroy everything you've worked for." The room seemed to grow colder as Adewale's world tilted on its axis. The letter in his hand, once a symbol of a simple decision, now felt like a ticking time bomb. "What are we going to do?" Amara whispered, her voice breaking as she looked at him with fear in her eyes. Adewale looked at the letter, then back at her. For the first time in a long while, he felt a surge of clarity, of purpose. "Tonight, everything changes," he said quietly, as he made a decision that would echo across his empire and beyond. As Adewale stood in his study, holding the sealed letter, his mind raced. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, heavier than he had ever imagined. The storm brewing outside seemed to mirror the turmoil inside him. Amara's words echoed in his ears, and the air in the room grew thick with tension. "Tonight, everything changes." He could feel the shift in the air, as if the universe itself was waiting for him to make a move. He looked at Amara, her face pale with fear, yet there was a fire in her eyes, an urgency that matched his own. "We need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. "We can't stay here. If they know you've made a move, they'll come for us." Adewale hesitated, the room feeling colder with every passing second. His fingers tightened around the letter in his hand. The world outside his mansion seemed so distant, so unreachable. His empire, his wealth, his success, they all seemed like fragile illusions now, meaningless in the face of this new threat. But the moment was not about fear. It was about survival, and perhaps something more, something he hadn't realized until now. "I won't run," he said firmly, though his voice carried a note of finality. "This is my life, Amara. I built it, and I'll defend it. If they want to take it from me, they'll have to do it face to face." Amara looked at him, her brow furrowed with concern. "Adewale, you're not just fighting for your business anymore. They're not after just money. They want everything. They want to control you, your every move. And they'll use anything they can against you." Her words struck him like a bolt of lightning. For the first time, Adewale realized the full scope of the danger. It wasn't just about power or wealth. It was about control, about stripping him of his autonomy. A sense of clarity washed over him. He wasn't just standing against an enemy of business or politics. He was standing against something far darker, something that threatened to engulf everything he had worked for, including the one person who had ever mattered to him beyond the gold and the fame. "You're right," he said, his voice now steady with resolve. "We can't run. We need to fight. But we won't fight alone." Amara looked up at him, her eyes wide, as though searching for some sign of what he meant. "What do you mean?" Adewale stepped forward, grabbing his phone from the desk and dialing a number he had not called in years. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered on the other end. "Sir Adewale," the voice said, gravelly and cautious. "Yes," he replied, his voice sharp. "I need you to come here. Now. I have a job for you. Something that requires all your resources. And make sure the others are with you." The voice hesitated for only a second before responding. "Understood, sir. We'll be there shortly." Adewale ended the call and turned to face Amara. She watched him, eyes filled with both admiration and fear. "What's going on, Adewale?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adewale stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of his decision settling on him like a weight he couldn't escape. "The people who want to take everything from me, Amara, they're closer than I ever thought. But they won't take it without a fight. I'm not running. I'm going to give them a choice. They can walk away, or they can face me head-on." Her eyes widened, but before she could speak, the sound of a car engine cut through the stillness of the night. It was low, deliberate, like the approach of a storm. "They're here," Adewale murmured, moving toward the door. He turned back to Amara, his eyes intense. "Stay close. This is about to get dangerous." Amara nodded, her face steely with determination. There was no turning back now. She had no idea what Adewale was planning, but she trusted him. She had always trusted him, even when she didn't fully understand him. The heavy front doors of the mansion opened with a creak as Adewale led the way outside. The darkness of the night was broken only by the headlights of the approaching vehicles. Two sleek black SUVs rolled to a stop in front of the mansion. The moment the doors opened, a group of heavily armed men emerged, their faces cold and unreadable. They were here. Adewale's pulse quickened as he stepped forward, meeting the men at the foot of the mansion's stairs. One of the men, a tall figure with dark sunglasses, stepped forward and gave Adewale a sharp nod. "Good evening, sir," the man said, his voice low and controlled. "I trust you've received our message?" Adewale didn't flinch. "I've received your message. But I have one of my own." The man's expression didn't change, but the tension in the air thickened. "You misunderstand, sir. There is no room for negotiation. Your assets are being seized as we speak. You are to surrender everything, now." Adewale stood tall, unwavering. "You don't get to dictate my terms. I've worked my entire life for what I have, and I will not bow to anyone who thinks they can just take it away." The man didn't seem surprised by Adewale's defiance. Instead, he smirked, the corners of his mouth curling in something that resembled amusement. "You misunderstand, sir," he said, his tone cold. "We are not here to negotiate. We are here to take what's ours." A chill ran down Adewale's spine as the man's words sank in. This wasn't just a business takeover. It was a power play, and they weren't going to stop until they had stripped him of everything. But Adewale wasn't backing down. With a swift movement, he raised his hand, signaling the men behind him to step forward. The two black SUVs were now surrounded by a group of his own people, his trusted allies who had been waiting in the shadows. They were just as prepared as he was for what was coming. "We can do this the hard way," Adewale said, his voice calm but laced with danger. "Or you can walk away and leave me and my family in peace." The man with the sunglasses chuckled darkly. "You think you can win this fight, Adewale? You don't understand who you're dealing with." Adewale's expression hardened, his hand resting on the edge of the letter still clutched in his grip. "I've been dealing with people like you my whole life. And I've always come out on top." As the two sides stood facing each other, the tension was palpable, the threat in the air almost suffocating. This wasn't just a battle for power, it was a battle for survival. And for the first time, Adewale felt the rush of something real, something raw. He wasn't just defending his wealth. He was defending everything he held dear, the life he had built, the woman he loved, and the future he wanted. And tonight, everything would change. The air crackled with tension as the two groups stood facing each other, locked in an invisible battle of wills. The dark silhouettes of Adewale's allies loomed behind him, their presence an unspoken promise of solidarity and strength. On the opposite side, the men with cold eyes and ruthless intentions remained unfazed, their hands resting on the weapons hidden beneath their jackets. Adewale's pulse quickened, but his resolve remained unshaken. He felt the weight of the moment settle over him. This wasn't just about a fight for wealth or power, it was about his very existence, his autonomy, and the future he had worked so hard to build. The stakes had never been higher, and tonight, everything would change. The man with the sunglasses stepped forward again, his smile slowly spreading into a grimace of contempt. "You still don't understand, do you, Adewale?" he sneered. "You're not in control here. You've made your choices, but the game is already over. You're already a pawn in our hands." Adewale's eyes hardened as he stepped forward, meeting the man's gaze with an unwavering intensity. He wasn't going to back down now. Not when he was so close to the edge, not when his future, and the future of those he loved, was hanging in the balance. "You may think you're in control," Adewale said, his voice a calm storm, but control is an illusion. You can take everything I have, but you'll never take my will. And that's the one thing you'll never be able to control. The man's face faltered for a brief moment, a flicker of something, perhaps doubt or frustration, crossing his features before it was quickly replaced by the cold indifference that had marked him from the start. Enough, he snapped. Take them. The command was barely spoken, but it was enough. The armed men surrounding Adewale moved in an instant, their hands reaching for their weapons, their steps coordinated and swift. But Adewale wasn't caught off guard. In the split second it took for the first man to draw his weapon, Adewale's allies sprang into action, their own weapons raised and ready. The night exploded into chaos. Adewale barely had time to process what was happening as the two groups clashed. The sounds of gunfire rang through the air, sharp and jarring, as men shouted orders and commands. The tension that had been building for so long finally broke, and everything, every decision, every sacrifice, culminated in this one moment of violent, chaotic confrontation. Adewale's heart raced, but his mind was as sharp as ever. His hand moved instinctively, drawing a sleek pistol from beneath his jacket. He fired in quick succession, each shot finding its mark with deadly precision. His enemies, though well-trained, were no match for the sheer ferocity of his retaliation. But it wasn't just his training or his wealth that made him powerful, it was the fire within him, the raw determination that came from knowing what was truly at stake. He was no longer just fighting for his life or his fortune, he was fighting for his future, for Amara, for everything he had ever loved. He turned his head for a fraction of a second, his eyes catching Amara's across the chaos. She stood a few paces behind him, her hands clasped tightly together, her face pale with fear but filled with a quiet resolve. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was here, with him, and that gave him the strength to push forward. He ducked behind a marble pillar, narrowly avoiding a bullet that whizzed past his head. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the battlefield, looking for his next target. The chaos around him seemed to slow down in his mind, his thoughts cutting through the noise like a sharp blade. There. One of the men had broken away from the group and was attempting to flank him. Adewale moved without hesitation, stepping into the man's line of sight just as he leveled his weapon. With a single shot, the man collapsed to the ground. A moment later, Adewale heard a cry. His gaze shot toward Amara, who was suddenly surrounded by two of the enemy's men. His blood ran cold. They were closing in on her. Amara, he shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony of gunfire. Without thinking, Adewale sprinted toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. The world seemed to narrow as his focus fixed solely on her safety. He reached her just as one of the men grabbed her arm, pulling her toward him. The other raised his weapon, aiming it directly at her. Time slowed. Adewale reached out, grabbing the gunman's arm with a fierce grip, twisting it until the weapon dropped to the ground. The second man's eyes widened in surprise, but it was too late. Adewale had already pulled him to the ground with a move honed from years of training, his knee pressing into the man's chest as he held him down with one arm. Don't ever touch her, Adewale growled, his voice low and threatening. Amara stood frozen, her face pale but her eyes locked on him with a mix of fear and admiration. She had never seen this side of Adewale before, this cold, focused fury that burned in his gaze. But she wasn't afraid. Not now. She had seen his strength, his resilience, and in this moment, she saw something else, something deeper. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for her, for everything they had built together. Adewale stood up, pulling Amara behind him. Get to the car, he said, his voice firm. Now. Amara hesitated for a second, but Adewale's commanding presence left no room for doubt. She turned and ran toward the black SUV parked nearby, her steps quick and light despite the chaos around them. Adewale followed closely behind, his hand never leaving the grip of his weapon. His allies were still engaged in the battle, but he had to get Amara to safety. That was the priority now. The fight could wait. As they neared the car, Adewale heard the sounds of approaching reinforcements. It wouldn't be long before they were overwhelmed if they didn't act fast. He pushed Amara into the back seat, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. When he was sure the coast was clear, he slammed the door shut and jumped into the driver's seat. "Hold on," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He ignited the engine, the sound of the car's engine roaring to life as he peeled out of the driveway. The mansion was now a distant memory, fading into the darkness behind them. Adewale's heart still raced, but his focus was unwavering. They had made it out, barely. But the night was far from over. As they sped down the winding road, Adewale's mind raced. This was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over. And if he was going to win, he needed to make a move that would change everything, something that would ensure his enemies would think twice before ever crossing him again. Adewale's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he sped through the dark streets, his eyes focused on the road ahead. The adrenaline still surged through him, but it was different now. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something far more precious. Amara's presence in the back seat was a silent reminder of that. He could feel her gaze on him, but he didn't dare look back. Not yet. There was no time for anything but the road and what lay ahead. The mansion was miles behind them now, but the battle was far from over. His enemies would not rest until they had taken everything from him. He knew that for certain. As they rounded a sharp corner, Adewale's phone buzzed in his pocket. His heart skipped a beat. He knew it was no coincidence. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The moment that would determine the fate of everything he had fought for. He glanced at the phone, his breath catching in his throat when he saw the name flashing across the screen. It was his old mentor, the one man who had always been by his side, the one who had taught him everything he knew about the game they played. "Hello?" Adewale's voice was steady, though a storm brewed within him. "Adewale," came the deep, calm voice on the other end. "You've made it this far. But it's not over yet. They're coming for you. All of them." A cold shiver ran down Adewale's spine. "What do you mean? I thought we were ready for this." "Your enemies don't fight fair," the mentor said. "They have the resources to get to you no matter where you go. And it's not just about power anymore. It's about something much more dangerous." Adewale's mind raced as he processed the words. Something more dangerous? What could be worse than the shadowy figure he had already faced tonight? He was about to respond when the sound of a helicopter's blades cutting through the air reached his ears. His heart nearly stopped. It was unmistakable. They had found him. They were coming. "Adewale, you need to leave now," his mentor urged. "They know where you are, and they're not stopping until they have you." Fear surged through Adewale's chest, but he swallowed it down. There was no time for fear. No time for hesitation. Not now. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator, the car leaping forward as the engine roared with fury. The helicopter's blades beat louder in the air above, drawing closer with each passing second. Amara's voice broke through the tense silence. "Adewale, what's happening?" "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice strained but determined. "They've found us. But we're not going down without a fight." Amara's hand found his, her fingers gripping his tightly. She didn't say a word, but the strength in her touch was enough to steady him. He wasn't alone in this. The helicopter's lights flashed in the rearview mirror, illuminating the road behind them. They were closing in. Adewale's mind raced, calculating every possible move. He couldn't outrun them, not like this. But there had to be another way. There always was. He had never been one to surrender. He had fought for his future, and he wasn't going to stop now. He swerved the car to the side, cutting across a narrow alley and sending it careening toward a dead end. Amara gasped, but Adewale's eyes were sharp, his mind already planning his next move. The helicopter hovered above them, its spotlight sweeping over the ground like a predator searching for its prey. He could hear the distant hum of soldiers closing in on foot. They were everywhere. But that was the thing about being underestimated. Adewale had always excelled in situations like this. He knew how to survive when it seemed impossible. He slammed the car into reverse, whipping it around with precision that only years of training could bring. The helicopter's spotlight flickered, disoriented for a moment as Adewale sped back into the maze of alleyways. He wasn't just running, he was setting a trap. The next few minutes felt like a blur. The car careened through the winding streets, sharp corners blurring by as Adewale pushed the vehicle to its limits. Behind him, the helicopter followed, relentless in its pursuit. He could hear the faint thump of soldiers closing in, but there was no turning back now. Then, in a split second, Adewale made his move. He swerved the car to a sudden stop, a perfect angle for the ambush he had been planning. The helicopter hovered overhead, its searchlight illuminating the area, unaware that Adewale had anticipated this exact moment. As the helicopter's spotlight passed over him, Adewale hit the gas again, this time charging straight for a nearby building that had a narrow exit. The helicopter, unable to react in time, continued to pursue, too focused on its target to see the trap. Adewale's plan worked. The helicopter's pursuit was cut short as it collided with a nearby structure, the impact shaking the ground beneath them. He could hear the crashing sound even over the roar of the car engine. A part of him knew they had just won this round. They were free, at least for now. Adewale's hands tightened around the wheel, his heart still racing but a new sense of determination filling him. He glanced over at Amara, who was staring at him wide-eyed but without fear. It was as if, in this moment, she truly understood the depth of his world, the world he had tried to shield her from. "We're not done yet," Adewale said, his voice low but resolute. "But we're one step closer to taking control." Amara nodded, her eyes burning with the same determination. "I'm with you. Always." With the helicopter gone and their immediate danger behind them, Adewale made a sharp turn, heading toward the safe house where he would regroup. The fight was far from over, but tonight had shown him something vital. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for justice. For Amara. And for everything he had ever believed in.